Yeah.
All right. See you later. Okay, guys. So we just finished our unit on modern political freedom, modern liberty, and our exemplar of that was Locke. And then we had a good time bringing Locke into context and also bringing Locke into our own lives, whether it's racial domination, um, and other various, the things we talked about with Locke. The transition into Marx is a bit of an abrupt one, but I'm going to get us to Marx through Eugene Debs. And there's a bunch of reasons why I'm doing that. One of the main ones is that just going into Marx is so hard and it's so challenging. And students often just have a really hard time. Either they're really excited about Marx and they're super, you know, plugged in and they're ready to learn about him, or they just basically drop out at this point, because going from Locke, which is easy for us to understand because it's our lives and our world, and the political reality of our lives is Lockean, and so it's easy for us to understand Locke. But when we introduce Marx, it's like the Tower of Babel. It's there's a lot of jargon and words that don't make any sense, and a lot of people have a real hard time just going straight into Marx. So one of the ways that we can begin a unit on Marx, among the many, is by beginning with Debs. And one way to begin with Debs is to begin by talking about labor unions. So Eugene Debs is going to be our introduction to Marx. The thrill of reading Debs is that he brings the Marxist tradition into America, into the American idiom, into the American lexicon. The words he uses are our American words. His Marxian experience is American, and so he communicates Marxism in a down-home manner, and it's easy for us to begin there. And then it's just, and so the reason why I'm sort of couchy about this is because there's a part of me that wants to just start with Marx and just start with the basics and then do things chronologically, and we would do Debs at the end of this. But there's a method for doing it this way, and I think it'll pay off in the long run. So Eugene Debs's background: he was born in Terre Haute, Indiana, to Alsatian immigrants. Alsace is a region in France. Um, so he's like a first or second. He's a second generation American. He became a railroad worker at age 14. So he's a 14-year-old railroad worker. And his first political organization, he gets involved in politics through the Brotherhood of Railroad Firemen. And so this is a sort of precursor to a modern labor union, but there were 2,000 railroad men killed on the job every year, railroad firemen. So railroad
Hey,
firemen is like a really big,
Brian, can I
yeah.
pause you? How old do you think he was in that picture?
He's probably 70, 60 or 70.
Okay, got it. I was gonna say, do you think he's like 30 years old in that
No,
picture? But
he's running for president at this point. So
okay.
this is later in life.
It's a bummer that we don't have child labor the way that we used to. I feel like that's a contributor to why we don't have these like amazing revolutionary thinkers.
Well,
I'm
we'll
serious.
see. So, well, part of the reason we don't have child workers is because of Eugene Debs. So, but so anyway, so the Brotherhood of Railroad Firemen is a sort of a union for railroad firemen, right? And Eugene Debs becomes a part of this, and it becomes a big union because of how dangerous this job is. There's 2,000 people that are killed each year doing this job. Another 20,000 are injured. And so Eugene Debs starts his political career in this organization, but he becomes increasingly convinced that craft unions, and what I mean by craft union is like the railroad firemen have a union, as opposed to just the railroad workers. That would be like a larger labor union, but a craft union. So we're just unionizing a part of the shop, to use union terms. But he becomes convinced that craft unions are ultimately defeated. They ultimately defeat the cause of labor. So as a broad strokes, like the gains of labor are defeated by unions that are only concerned with specific crafts. And so he breaks with this Brotherhood of Railroad Firemen, and he forms the American Railway Union in 1893. And included in this union is both skilled and unskilled workers. And this is a union that is, you can kind of draw a line from this union to modern railway unions, which have been sort of like collapsed into each other, which, that's really the history of unionism in this country. Is there's so many of them and they all get sort of like gobbled up by massive ones. But this union ends up making headlines at the end of last year when Joe Biden steps in to break essentially a strike, or thwart a potential strike. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. But so Debs forms that union, and then he makes this union really makes his name, and Debs makes his name with what's called the Pullman strike, which is like it's on like your APUSH tests. It's a big a historical event in American history. The Pullman strike is in May 1894, and it deals with this ARU, the American Railway Union. They've organized workers of a particular factory. It's the Pullman Railway Factory. Pullman Railway Company. What they do is they make passenger cars and then they sell them to other railroad companies, right? And so Pullman, Illinois is a company, or Pullman is the name of the firm. It's in Pullman, Illinois. And so Pullman and so the workers of this factory they were protesting cuts in wages that were imposed in response to the Panic of 1893. The wages were cut by 50%, but the rents, the cost of living in Pullman, Illinois stayed the same. Now, we may scoff at this and say something like, well, what does the company that employs these folks have to do about the rents of the town that they work in? But if you caught on, it's the name of the town is Pullman, and the name of the company is Pullman, and so this is a company town, which is a sort of a vestige of a bygone era. The company owns the land, they own the tenements, they own the people that are working for the company, they own everything, and so they pretty much directly have control over the rents of this town. And so they cut the wages, but they don't lower the rents. The cost of eggs stays the same, etc.
That is so savage.
And so these workers were immiserated by their employer at both like the income and consumption levels. This strike ends up getting national attention. This is a strike. The strike is led by Eugene Debs. It gets national attention, and it's one of the first sort of times in American life, political life, where issues of wage, it was called wage slavery at a certain time. We now just call it employment. But it began to sort of stoke into the minds of folks the difference between the interests of capital and the difference between the interests of workers, that they both don't share the same interests. And this is a sort of this is a new idea, right? This is something that flies in the face of what was sort of promised. What it's still being promised to us, I think, which is the idea that the owners, what benefits the owners will benefit you. We're all in the same boat, etc. But there just began to be this inkling of an idea that there's a distinction between the interests of the owners and the interests of the workers, and oftentimes they're at odds with each other, right? So in June 1894, the American Railway Union, the union that's behind the strike, they voted not to work any train carrying a Pullman sleeping car. And this disrupted rail traffic nationwide. So this is a strike that is linked with a boycott, right? There's a strike where the workers are not working, but they're also calling for a national boycott. So folks that are, just your average consumer is being called to, like, hey, you're a worker too, right? Do you own a railroad or a railway company or a factory? Okay, you're a worker, then you should join with us in our boycott. we share the same interests. We're both workers, right? And so they call for a boycott, and the boycott ends up being rather successful for a small period of time. We can talk about boycotts later. They might not be as effective as we once thought. So the federal government. So there's a short-term defeat, however, in this during this strike and boycott. The federal government intervened and joined workers from boycotting. Prevented the workers from boycotting. Debs went to jail for defying the ban on the boycott. The strike was broken by mid-July. Folks returned to work. And I'll just say this. This was, perhaps the first in a long line of labor actions that are ended by government intervention. Starting here through Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers to Biden and Congress undercutting the negotiations between another railroad worker strike to impose a labor agreement late last year. We'll have to wait till Marx over the next few weeks to tell us why this is philosophically, but just by the evidence here, we have to assert that government's desire to ensure labor peace routinely has the effect of empowering capital to crush labor. It's very rarely the other way around, where the government sort of sides with labor to force capital to do something. It's almost routinely this direction. But so while there was a short-term defeat, the strike, the strike was broken. The boycott was outlawed. Was made to be illegal. There was a long-term victory. The public scrutiny of Pullman and his paternalism, became a sort of like very common topic. There was a federal investigative panel was created that ended up criticizing Pullman's paternalism and refusal to arbitrate. There was a federal acknowledgement of the need for unions and curbs on corporate power. And also, perhaps most critically, Debs read Marx's Capital while in jail. So Debs wasn't quite a Marxist yet, but once he went to jail for engaging in this boycott, he ends up reading Marx. And he converts to socialism as an economic philosophy. And we'll read a little bit of what he has to say about that. The making Marxism real. But so what he ends up doing, he leaves jail and he forms the Socialist Party of America in 1901. And so the Socialist Party of America, it's united the German American immigrants who had done the first major socialist organizing in the United States before this. It united the American labor movement. It brought into the fold the Eastern European immigrants with socialist connections back home, and homegrown radical reformers who were, mainly like descendants of abolitionists. And united them all into one party. What's noteworthy about this is that what's interesting to us, I think, is that it was mainly a small town and rural constituency. Railroad mechanics, teachers, ministers, farmers. These folks were not sort of, as you can imagine, they're not like high class financiers, right? They're down home country boys. They formed study clubs. They wrote for the local press. It was very much not only a political organization. It was they did a lot of sort of like community work, right? We might use the term community organizing now, but they did a whole lot of sort of mutual aid. They created schools, they distributed goods, they raised money for folks that were in need. There was a lot of sort of like giving back to the community kind of vibe. It wasn't simply just like, let's run candidates for office kind of idea, which is, yeah.
Sorry, what year was that?
This is the early 1901 is like the year that this started.
Okay, so would you say that was there a socialist party in Europe at this point?
Oh yeah, big time.
Okay,
Yeah,
I was just curious. So
totally.
this was this kind of came over from them in a way, yeah?
Yeah, so Debs is very much influenced by them. And then so what I said earlier is that like the folks that sort of immigrated here and found out there were no socialists here in America, he brought them into the fold, along with like the sort of radicalized railroad workers and abolitionists and folks that were already here that might have been interested in being a social, being politically organized as a socialist. But yeah, so the thing that I haven't said here, which I think you're mentioning, is that there's a worldwide movement. This is after Marx. This is after Marx had become
How long
by this
after?
point the Communist Manifesto is up there with the Bible as far as like in the third world, what's being read, what people are asked to be buried with, in their caskets. It's the Bible and then the Communist Manifesto. That's like, it's a very common thing to say. Is like, I would rather be buried with the communist. Whatever. Obviously not in this country. In this country, there's none of that's happening until Debs. But this is 50 years after the Communist Manifesto. Is I think the answer to your question.
Guess it's no surprise our country is so superior than all those boneheads.
We can talk about that. But so like we're gonna again, I'm gonna take us back in time. I hope to answer all those sort of like historical questions, what's going on elsewhere and stuff like this.
Okay.
Again, this is just I wish that there's a better way to do this. There might be, but like the way that I decided to do it is to do Debs first, and then we'll go back to do Marx. So again, so this is a socialist organization within the American party system, right? The American party system that we all know only can produce two viable parties, right? They ran Debs for every presidential election for 20 years, from 1900 to 1920. He ran for every presidential election. His greatest performance was in 1912 when he won 6% of the vote, which is like equivalent to 9 million votes today. He won almost 1 million votes in 1920, the last time he ran, when he ran from prison. He was serving 2 years for espionage, and he won 1 million votes running for prison. And so he's, famously, he's like, referred to as the candidate who ran from prison. We might have another one this coming election. We might have a second version.
Maybe he'll beat. Maybe Donald will beat his record.
They probably. I would expect so.
I
Yeah.
thought there was another one besides Debs who ran from prison.
Debs is like, well, I'm
If
sure every convict wants.
If someone runs from prison and wins, can they pardon themselves?
These are questions that the Constitution does not help us answer, but probably, yeah. I mean, I would assume so. Yeah. Well, so Mitch, yeah. So I would assume a ton of people have ran for president. I think Debs is like, what we could say about Debs is he won the most votes, right, from prison. He's the one that we remember. So anyway, so the Socialist Party of America, what ends up turning into the more lasting political organization that Debs helps to found is the IWW, which is the one big union, right? It's the other way to say this is across lines of skill, nationality, and gender. Disdained their idea was that they disdained gradual gains and even collective bargaining. What they sought was an abolition of the wage system. They weren't there to negotiate better, terms on their, employment under in an unfair system.
Wait, I'm not saying this to just kick shit around. I don't understand. What were they advocating for in place of wages?
Well, you can imagine, so like a barter system. Usually what people say when they're talking about ending wage slavery, what they're referring to is like each worker gets to receive what they've put into it, right? There's some sort of equation that it's not based on how much can the capitalist exploit you, which is what they would say the wage system is. But they would say like, I get a share or my equal share of the profits of the company, right? It's usually some sort of worker co-op is like the alternative to a wage system.
What about like the costs of the infrastructure and the financial risk taken on by the capital?
This will all be borne by the workers as so. These are good questions. let me tell you what Debs
Okay, cool. Sorry,
specifically has to say. Great question, and then we can like sort of talk about that, because that is precisely the sort of like where we want to start, I think.
Okay.
So the major ideas in Debs, the first one to start with is that classes exist. They're defined by the relationship to the means of production. Again, this is going to get us towards what your question is aiming at here. And so what the first thing I want to say is just to give you a little bit of hint of like what Debs is talking about, where his just a sample of his like his vibe, his style here. So this is what he says. So he's talking, this is an essay called How I Became a Socialist. And so essentially what happens here is he goes to prison after working as a sort of labor organizer, and he reads Marx, and what he finds in Marx is like an enunciation of what he's been feeling his whole life, right? And so this is what he says before he goes to prison, before he reads Marx, whatever. Through all these years, as a young man, I was nourished at Fountain Proletaire. I drank deeply of its waters, and every particle of my tissue became saturated with the spirit of the working class. I had fired an engine and been stung by the exposure and hardship of the rail. I was with the boys in their weary watches, at the broken engine's side, and often helped to bear their bruised and bleeding bodies back to wife and child again. How could I but feel the burden of their wrongs? How could the seed of agitation fail to take root in my heart? And so I was spurned on by the work of organizing, not the firemen merely, but the brakemen, switchmen, telegraphers, shopmen, track hands, all of them, in fact. And as I had now become known as an organizer, the calls came from all sides, and there are but few trades I have not helped organize, and less still in whose strikes I have not at some time had a hand. So here he's sort of telling us how he saw beyond the interests of just the firemen union that he was initially a part of. And this is how things used to be. It was just your particular job title. You had a union, and then the people working across the office in the different part of the firm, they had a union. And so he's telling us, no, like I saw how we were all in the same boat. None of us owned the company. None of us sort of like took an equal share in what we produced. And so that's his first, crack into this idea of proletarianism. But he has this to say elsewhere, 123. He says, what is your status in society today? This is a different essay. This is a speech, actually, he's giving. You can imagine a rally he's at. He's trying to agitate the folks listening. He says, what is your status in society today? You are a human being, a wage worker. Here you stand just as you were created, and you have two hands that represent your labor or power. But you do not work. And why not? For the simple reason that you have no tools with which to work. You cannot compete against the machinery of the capitalist with your bare hands. You cannot work unless you have access to it. And you can only secure access to it by selling your labor power. That is to say, your energy, your vitality, your life itself, to the capitalist who owns the tool with which you work, and without which you are idle and suffer all the ills that idleness entails. So here, he's telling Howard, isn't he sort of like telling you, he's sort of voicing your critique here. He's saying, the capitalist has already undertaken the burden of buying the stuff, right? Like,
I want to finish hearing what you have to say, but I don't think he's real. Yeah, let me hear.
you suspect I'm trying to trick you, don't you?
No, I don't. I just don't. I don't think I truly, again, not kicking shit. I don't think that really addresses the root of what I'm getting at, which is
okay.
like. But yeah, I want to hear what you have to say first.
Okay, and then you can tell me what's wrong about it. Yeah. And so then he goes on to say, in the evolution of capitalism, society has been divided mainly into two economic classes. A relatively small class of capitalists who own tools in the form of great machines they did not make and cannot use, and a great body of many millions of workers who did make these tools and do use them, and whose very lives depend upon them, yet who do not own them. And these millions of wage workers, producers of wealth, are forced into the labor market in competition with each other, disposing of their labor power to the capitalist class in consideration of just enough of what they produce to keep them in working order. They are exploited of the greater share of what their labor produces, so that while upon one hand, they can produce in great abundance, upon the other, they can consume but that share of the product that their meager wages will buy. And every now and then it follows that they have produced more than can be consumed in the present system, and then they are displaced by the very products of their own labor. The mills and shops and mines and quarries in which they are employed close down, the tools are locked up, and they are locked out, and they find themselves idle and helpless in the shadow of the very abundance their labor has created. So I think that, I mean, that's a very Marxist thing. Everything Marx is everywhere here, and we'll find it later. But I think I always am struck by that notion of how the more productive the worker is, the more wealth they create, the more likely their job is going to be removed from them, right? Because they have sort of created such abundance that the company no longer needs to create the product that it's selling. Like even the price of that product has plummeted because the worker has been so productive. It's created so much, you know, it on a very simple level, you know, that, you know, I'm explaining in a very simple way this phenomenon that can be sort of much further extrapolated. But anyway, so what do we have to say about this long quote? Is it like, what's he getting wrong here? I guess two divisions of people, right?
Yeah, I don't necessarily know if I think he's getting stuff wrong as much as I think that there's this like he's ignoring this whole concept of, or he's ignoring like a big piece of the equation, I guess is a better way to put it, in the sense that like, okay, sure, let's say I can sign off on this idea that like, oh, the poor workers, these owners of capital, they own all the tools, and these poor workers are now at their mercy because they have no means to acquire capital to get their own tools, but they can't, do their trade without the tools, and so they're victims, right? So let's say I'm like conceding that, which I'm not. But what about the risk that was taken on by the capital owners originally? What about the personal liability that they carried to purchase those tools? What about the expenditure of either knowledge or labor to initially acquire the capital to get those tools? And even if it was inherited, right, that is still finite capital that was expended for those tools. What about the intellectual capital that drove the ideas, and then the risk that followed that of their time and their lives to acquire those tools? So am I saying that like inherently those capitalists are more noble or more worthy or more important than the wage slaves, to use his language? Not in the slightest. But I am saying that to ignore that expenditure of time, energy, thought, risk, or very real capital is fucking retarded. It doesn't make sense. And I think that maybe perhaps that's why people like me are so averse to, like, again, dude, I feel bad. It sounds like these fucking people are being taken advantage of and being like mistreated and being abused.
Yeah.
And like, absolutely, they need.
But you're right to remove the humanitarian thing, and let's just focus on like
Okay.
and you're right to do that. Yeah, I sense that that's what you want to do, and I want to give you permission
just to be
do that.
clear, I think that they were right to organize and fucking fight for their rights 100%.
Yeah,
but again, just like removing that piece of the equation, how do you fucking wrap your head around all the other stuff?
The ingenuity of the capitalist, right?
Well, not
has
just
to
the
be
ingenuity,
accounted
but
for,
the
right?
risk, dude, the
The
risk that
creativity.
they take on. Dude,
yeah, the risk. I mean, I don't know. So sure, yeah.
Well, hold on though. Okay, let's
throw
use
it
an
all
example. Let's use no, but I think you're like discounting that so quickly, like it's almost a joke to you. But all like, what about, again, use any friend of yours that that has started a company, that's invested their own money in the company, that's taken the risk of not working a regular wage job with that company, and then taking the risk of taking on debt to support that company and all the different things. Like, those are very real trade-offs that can go sideways. I'll tell you personally, I started a company that ultimately failed, right? Like, there were very real trade-offs, both financially and in terms of my time.
Debs will have an answer to this, but I wonder if does anybody have like a response to Howard or can join
Yeah,
in
I
like a,
think I think the idea of financial risk is as someone who has taken significant financial risk to start companies that are successful, I would say that it's not so much the way you're putting that makes it sound like there's something valuable there or something like tangible in terms of debt. Taking on debt, what I really feel is what it is a lack of knowledge, especially in the United States, where it's like taking on debt is nothing more than a tool to be utilized. And I feel like there's a lot of stigma around that, and knowing how to manage and take on and be afforded the ability to take on loans. I think all of the capital that was utilized to purchase these tools was definitely not owned by the company owner when they started the company. It was for sure borrowed. And I think the ability to borrow money and then implement it and utilize that is like a knowledge based thing, not a tangible asset that was taken as risk. That's the
and
only
it's
thing I have to say.
privileged, right? It's like only certain types of people get
Well,
access to that world, right?
right. It's not the capital that was inherited. It's the ability
Social
to
capital, right?
borrow.
Like,
And if there's
yeah.
there's nothing, I mean, I have some issues with unions for sure, but I have much more issues with people who with lenders, with predatory lenders and capital, making money off of capital.
Mhm.
I think that's where we're fucked up. Not in borrowing money, but like just how aggressive that shit is and how unequal the terms are sometimes. I have a problem with, I think. So that's my only rebuttal. I'm not saying Howard's theory.
Yeah, I don't think Howard's wrong either. I think, Howard, if you hold on to that and keep challenging me and us and everybody, I think that would be helpful. I do want to move on to Debs's
I do think
response to you, but I
do-
think that it's worthwhile to hear your guys' perspective as capitalists.
I have a problem with people. I do have a problem with people being given things that they don't deserve. I do have
Yeah.
a problem with that. And one of those things includes the same pay as everyone else when they're shittier workers. I have a problem with that.
Okay.
For sure.
Well, so I won't show you that quote because it's maybe not helpful here, but so good. So the major idea in Debs, classes exist, right? It's not a mystification. It's not some sort of like way to divide us against them or whatever. Like this, it's a very real thing. There are two different types of people in this world. There are people who have access to the means of production via ownership, and the people have access to the means of production where they're forced, that you can't live another way in the system. You can't just sort of decide to be a bohemian. I mean, you can, I guess, but like there's no real way to sort of survive other than selling your labor power, being sort of forced into the system, right? Because the tools are owned by somebody else, and the access to them as far as ownership is reserved for those that can. And so that, those two classes, we'll leave that aside. We're gonna come back to that in the coming weeks. The next major idea, which is Debs's response to the Howard's objection, I think I could say something like that. I think is this idea of socialism, and so he will tell us what he means by socialism here, and he tells us in a very, I think, a really nice way. I think it's a really great way to think about what people are after when they talk about socialism. And so what he has to say is, at the beginning of industrial society, men worked with hand tools. A boy could learn a trade, make himself the master of the simple tools with which he worked, and employ himself and enjoy what he produced. But that simple tool of a century ago has become a mammoth social instrument. In a word, that tool has become socialized. Not only this, but production has been socialized. As small commodity as a pin or a pen or a match involves for its production all of the social labor of the land, but this evolution is not yet complete. The tool has been socialized, production has been socialized, and now ownership must also be socialized. In other words, those great social instruments that are used in modern industry for the production of wealth, those great social agencies that are socially made and socially used must also be socially owned.
Can
And then he
I,
gets a
can I,
nice supplies applause after
can I
that.
comment really quick on something?
Sure.
Just without starting a whole, what I hear in that is almost a little bit of a different response from what you gave me. What I hear in that is him
Totally.
almost
It's a
like
different, yeah.
agreeing with what I'm saying, but just saying, but that's irrelevant now. We've evolved past that.
That's exactly, I think so. I think that that's, yeah, like I gave you my response, which is to say, you know, the risk is there, but also the ingenuity and stuff like that. But like, I think all that can be collapsed into the workers themselves, whatever. But his response to you is to say something like, the risk that you are saying that that capitalist is undertaking is actually, he's only really contributing like an infinitesimal amount of himself into this endeavor. He is standing upon the shoulders of giants.
Sure.
The combined history of the entire human race, along with the, you know, it's not here in Debs, but other people have made this argument. The natural world that we exploit on a day-to-day basis also is a part of this equation. You know, the ingenuity or the sort of the you know, creativity or the risk of the capitalist is the infinitesimally small part of the equation. What actually is a much faster, more important thing to focus on is how we have all contributed, all of us, our ancestors, everything that we, you know, have in our lives today is the sum total of every single human endeavor. And so we all sort of enjoy, you know, some small aspects of that. You know, whether it's the computer that we're using to talk to you guys on, you know, like, you know, folks want to monetize every aspect of that, right? We're all paying hundreds of dollars to Comcast and our energy bills or whatever, but none of them invented this technology, right? You know, they might have had a patent for some, you know, small innovation here or there, but like all of us are sort of like enjoying the fruits of a socialized endeavor called human life. You know, the production has been socialized, right? You know, it's being used socially. Why aren't we sort of owning things socially? Why isn't the sort of the great vast benefits of all these, you know, wonderful things that we're sort of being fed into our lives, why aren't they being shared? And so that's one sort of like attempt. That's a first pass attempt at like this idea, this grand idea that like there could be another way to sort of organize these things, and it doesn't have to be based upon ownership, private ownership. You know, when we talk about abolishing private property, this is the kind of realm we're talking in. We're not talking about taking away the toothbrush or whatever. We're talking about taking away this fictitious idea that each of us has sole ownership over anything, really, right? It's like all of it is actually has much more going into it than our small part of it, right? So that's, I didn't really explain it very well, I think, but does anybody have any thoughts about this? Counters to that, responses?
I mean, I think he's exactly right. I mean, the publication that I work for could not exist without my labor, without my colleagues' labors.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it that, you know, the people at the top get to benefit the most from the work that myself and my colleagues put in?
Yeah, he talks about this. This is I really like this quote. He
So
says,
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
So kind of building on that concept,
Mhm.
maybe perhaps for a machine worker, right? They couldn't afford the mill, the fucking, you know, $25 million mill, right? But why a worker whose inputs are intellectual capital, why can't the workers just in that situation where, why are these fucking bigwigs benefiting from all of our work? That sucks. We're being mistreated. Why not just quit and go start your own thing and go make your own, become the bigwig. That's what I guess confuses me about that concept.
Mhm.
Well, not everybody has the means to do that. You know, if you're so exploited in the labor workforce, how are you ever going to dig yourself out of that hole? You know, you're already starting at a massive disadvantage, way further down, I guess, the societal food chain than the people who own the company at the top. Because I believe it was, I don't know if it was you, Howard, or you, Brian, but y'all were, you know, kind of talking about that sort of like responsibility that these employers take on, you know, and if employees are a big, you know, important thing, a big expense for companies to take on, because once again, without our labor, their idea, their product, their innovation, you know, would not come to fruition, right? Why is it that we're the first, you know, our people are the first to be exploited before anybody else? And it is because depending on the jobs, there are so many of us and there's only so many jobs, and there's a lot of factors in play. There's classism, there's sexism, there's racism, there's I don't remember the ism when it comes to religion and ethnic origin and all of that stuff. So when we ask, well, why can't they just go out and do this? There is a host of reasons why everybody doesn't have the same opportunity as the next person. Maybe they come from the same background, or they don't. Maybe their skin color is the same, or it's not. So when your society is inequitable in that manner, you know, it kind of, you kind of skew towards feudalism almost, because somebody is stuck in one class for their entire life because the system is designed that way. So.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. I suppose that it certainly isn't black and white. I guess it's hard for me to fully like concede to that concept when and I know what Brian has said to me saying this before, so I almost hesitate to say it, but it's just my truth. It's hard for me to fully concede to that concept when there's so many examples of individuals that did start from like below zero, that have successfully kind of like clawed their way through the muck of all of those very real barriers that you outlined to be successful, right? And to take advantage of the myriad opportunities that are kind of presented for them in this country. And so, but I concede it's a complex issue, right? I think like expecting for every single person to have like an Oprah success story is not only unrealistic, but it's just it's logically like it can't happen, right? To expect everyone to hit the lottery in that sense. But it's just tough for me to like, okay, so everyone's a victim and that's the responsibility of the employers to rectify when they're the ones. It's tough.
I wouldn't, right. And I would encourage you, I think the way for you to see through it is in your own answer, right? Because on one hand, you're saying that you agree and you recognize that not everybody is in that position, but then we have these stories of other people. It's like, yes, we do. But by your own admission, we also have the stories of the other people. We can't just take care of one group of people.
Well,
right?
no, you just nailed it there. I think that's like the fundamental disagreement, right? Where it's like, no, yeah, for sure, you're right. But I guess then it comes down to like whose responsibility is it to take care of those people? And this is going to sound heartless, but in my mind, I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not really concerned about those people. I'm concerned about my family and providing my family with the opportunities and the safety and the security that they need. But no, I don't feel any obligation to be responsible for those other people. And so I think that's kind of like the fundamental difference is I kind of subscribe to this concept that if every individual looked after their family and you know did that, then net things would be better, which you know history shows us, right? Since the advent of capitalism, global poverty is decreased by a tremendous amount and da 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 da. But yeah, sure, if you're if your original orientation is that, no, someone else has an obligation to take care of me, it's not my job to take care of my own family, then for sure I would I would take issue with some of the things I'm saying as well. And I'm not saying that I'm inherently right or that someone else is inherently wrong. I just know that for me personally,
So why run a business if you don't want to take care of your employees and make sure they're okay?
well, to provide
And
a good service and to take care of your family and to generate profits.
but you just said you don't care about employees.
No, well, but yeah, I don't not care about employees, but but that's fine. So like just
You
playing
did
this,
kind of
this,
say that
You-
though. You
you
basically said like,
did,
I'm going
yeah.
to take advantage of my employees as much as I need to in order to take care of
no,
myself.
that's unfair to put those words in my mouth. I never
That's what
said
you
that.
said. That's
I don't know.
Well, that's fine.
I'm not sure that that's inherently wrong. I'm just gonna go out there and say
Yeah,
that.
well, so
Like
what I
it's
would
at a
say,
certain point is if that makes you, if that provides you with the security you need, then that's like saying like the lion who has to make his kill first is the one who, it's like a natural process in our world.
Yeah, but we're not wild animals. We're
I
a
think,
civilized
yeah,
society.
I think that's the
Yeah.
problem, right? Where now
Maybe.
the problem with capitalism, right? You have people who are inherently empathetic to individuals. They're like, okay, I'm going to start this business. I have this great idea, and I want the people that work for me to also benefit from this and to have great. And I want them, if I'm going to ask them for their time for 40 hours a week, and I know that this is their only job, I'm going to provide them a livable wage, right? And there are people like that exist.
Well, livable
And then
wage
there
is
are
one
people,
thing, but
yeah, and then there are people who are like,
what
well,
about equity in your company?
what is the bottom line
that's
here?
what this is
How
kinda
little can I
suggesting.
pay them so that I can get, a better bottom line on how much I'm
Well,
making?
but hold on, you're
right?
putting words in my mouth.
I'm not
I
saying
didn't-
you said this. I'm explaining my own point of view.
Okay. That's
I
okay.
think that's the logic of capitalism is, as articulated by Debs and certainly by Marx, that it will tend, like, whatever your sort of like personal, like, humanitarian leanings are, as a owner of capital, you will tend towards finding out what's the least amount I can pay a worker such that they will continue to work for me and such that I can basically trick them into creating surplus value for me.
Well, okay, hold on. So I literally, prior to this Zoom starting, I was writing
Mhm.
up contracts for one of my companies and writing up contracts for onboarding some new employees. And there was that a factor? 100%. I was sitting here calculating based on the number of clients that I assigned to them, based on knowing the amount that I'm going to be making per client, flexing that number up and down to hit like that sweet spot where I'm collecting like a sizable profit.
Yeah.
So yes, is that a factor? 100% it is. Another factor though was also, hey, look, I know based on the nature of this business, especially in the specific business I'm referring to, this person could absolutely go out and do this themselves. It requires very little capital investment. In fact, it just requires some salesmanship. And
So you better pay them more, right?
Yeah. And so there was also the other
Yeah.
competing interest was I need to make sure this person is kept happy as well.
Yeah,
right?
or
And
else
I'll
they
tell
might
you,
find a different job, or
and so I'll tell you that, right? I have
what
one
happens when
employee-
they leave?
Well,
What happens? Forget them. What happens to you when they find a better job or start their own company?
No,
What happens
great
to your
question.
bottom
So
line?
the other thing that I was doing is writing out certain non-compete agreements, which realistically aren't that enforceable in California. But I was writing out
Love that.
non-compete agreements.
Love that for you.
And-
But let's say
hold on,
it's illegal
let me
to do
finish.
that.
Okay, so then the
Because I
other
think
thing I was
that's
also
better.
doing is building out a competing pay structure to bring on my second employee, because I need to have a contingency in place for when inevitably that first employee leaves.
Okay.
Right.
Why do you need a contingency?
Well, because I'll tell you why, if you want to get really granular, because that first employee, I pay a gratuitous amount. I way overpay him. He makes he makes more money than I do.
But if you don't do that, if you
Well, no,
pay
hold
them,
on, hold on. He makes more money than I do in my company.
okay, I
He
don't care.
makes-
If
he-
you don't do that, what happens?
Well, what he's already going to do is he's eventually going to go start his own business.
Okay, but why is that a problem for you?
Well, because now I have to bring on a new employee and train them.
Why do you have to do that? Why can't you just do it?
Because I don't fucking have time to do it, and I have other things to do.
You
That's
make
the
more
point.
money, right? Don't you make more money when you can share the load and you have somebody else to do the work
Well,
and
yeah,
you
of
can do
course,
other
but that,
stuff?
yeah, yeah.
Well, that's the simple idea here. You get more value out of that employment structure. You make more money ultimately when you find that a right
Dude,
sort of like medium spot, right? It's not a race to the bottom, but it is a race to the
no,
as
not
low as
even
you fucking can
close.
go.
Dude, it's
It
not
is as
though.
but of course it is. Of course it is. It's the lowest price you possibly could pay, but it's high. I'm not saying it's not
No,
low. I'm not saying it's like it's extremely low. I'm saying it's high, but it's as low as you possibly can make it. And it's not, you're not wrong to do it, Howard. I'm not like lambasting you or saying you're a bad person.
I,
You're doing what everybody does in this system, which is fine. It's the way it is. Isn't
okay,
it true?
It's the way it has to be because we have no other system. We're stuck in it unless something big changes.
Isn't that true, Howard? Is it
I-
like
I would
you make more
argue.
money when you find the right amount so that he still works for you?
Okay, sure. I mean, I suppose that what you're saying is true. I I'm trying to I'm trying to come up with like, I'm trying to organize my thoughts around this because I don't, it's tough because in this specific situation that I'm using as an example, which is perhaps a bad one because this is a very small company that has a single employee right now, and perhaps that, and the single employee makes substantially more than the owners do,
There's a
and is
personal
grossly,
element.
and he's grossly overpaid, but it's worth it to me for him to remain happy. So this is perhaps a bad example, but what
I
I
hear you.
guess,
Yeah.
what I'm getting at is I think that there is, rather than you, then I think what I hear you and Joanna saying is you're outlining this very parasitic relationship where in my, and I'm not just saying this as an intellectual exercise, in my mind, capitalism can be just as much a symbiotic relationship.
Okay.
Certainly, can it be practiced in a parasitic way? And certainly have I witnessed in fucking a really grotesque way what that looks like.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Capitalism can host truly disgusting transgressions again and taking advantage of people without a doubt. But I would argue that social systems, I mean, we could think of fucking a lot more examples of that taking place in different iterations of socialism. And I would also argue that capitalism creates a space where a truly symbiotic relationship can exist. And that's why, not to shoot myself in the foot, that's why government regulation and moral safeguards are so important. So that capitalism unfettered cannot be a race to the bottom that crushes all but a small group of privileged few. But to throw the baby out with the bathwater
Mhm.
is equally ludicrous.
I think what Debs is after here is a maximizing of that symbiotic relationship that you're talking about. What he would say something like, what you have noticed, what you have stumbled on into is how lovely and glorious and amazing working together as human beings towards a common goal and without competing interests can be. It can be a wonderful situation where we can throw ideas off each other and iterate on each other's ideas and pick up each other's slack when we need to and help each other grow both as workers but as human beings. And what capitalism does is it makes that instance rare more often than not because it creates a hierarchy of when there doesn't need to be. And so that's the sort of socialist response to you, is that like we both share this the love of this symbiotic relationship that can happen at work in labor in certain respects. But they would say that you've misidentified what's actually happening there. It's not capitalism causing that symbiosis or symbiotic relationship. It's actually just how wonderful working, being a human being that's laboring is. That's what they would say.
Okay, well, I know we're going to get to Marx, so maybe we wait to go down this rabbit hole about capitalism versus social systems.
Cool.
Because I have a response to that, but I think it's like jumping ahead of what we're trying to discuss.
Sure, I think so too. Yeah. So another major idea in Debs, and again, these are all sort of like prefiguring where we're going to go in Marx, but it's just fun to bring it up in this context. It's easier in this context because we're going to read like German translations in the next few weeks, which is a little bit more, it's more enlivening and rich, but it's less, right in our face. But so this is the idea of the historical evolution. So the question was asked earlier, why don't we just, if you're so immiserated but in the system, why don't you go do something about it? Why don't you get a different job or whatever like that, right? And so the socialist idea as a response to this, it's usually a appeal towards some sort of like historical, or even looking in the future idea that like things inevitably will unfold into the next system, right? You're right. Why don't we do something about this? Is usually the sort of response. And so this is what Debs has to say about this. He says, in the ancient world for thousands of years, workers were abject slaves. In the Middle Ages, serfs. In modern times, wage workers. To become free men in socialism, the next inevitable phase of advancing civilization. So what we will do about this, why don't we just go, increase our lot in life? Why don't we go make things better? What we will do is we will engage in a worker revolution. We will not just go start another company and do to others that was done to us or whatever, right? We will not sort of just like make a competitor to our former bosses, company. What we will do is we will fundamentally alter the wage system. We will replace the ownership, the private ownership of the means of production with social ownership of the means of production. And it looks something like this. We insist that working men must organize. So this is the political use of the word organize, right? We're going to use, we see it all the time now. But Debs really sort of gives it to us. This idea that when we organize, that's when we're doing something political, or we're sort of recognizing some sort of fact that like causes us to break out of the doldrums of our day-to-day lives. But we insist that working men must organize to get rid of capitalists and make themselves the masters of the tools with which they work, freely employ themselves, secure to themselves all they produce, and enjoy the full fruit of their labors. And so again, this is again, this idea, Maverick, you brought up this idea that sometimes you recognize people get paid or they receive something that does not belong to them. They haven't contributed as much as they are receiving from. And this is very much at the heart.
Hold on. I'm sorry. That's not
Okay.
what I said at all. I'm
Okay.
saying purely like effort, intelligence, ability, natural ability is what I was saying. I like hate when I hire two people at the same time and one is just way better than the other, right?
And you have to pay them both the same.
I feel like I have to pay them both the same. Yeah. That's
Doesn't
what
that lie more on you though?
Sure,
Like
but
you
in
hired
well,
both of
I
them.
do that. I do that now. I make that choice, right?
Right.
But what I don't like is the idea of a union forcing me to pay both of those people.
Oh, okay.
That's what I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah, so we didn't really even talk
that,
about collective bargaining.
No, I know,
but
that's what I was bringing up earlier. We were talking about a completely different point, but I wasn't talking about them and like not having ownership over the tools and then therefore.
Yeah, but aren't you fallible too? Sometimes you don't really, I'm not saying you, I'm saying us. Sometimes we don't have the greatest eye as managers or whatever, supervisors.
Do I make mistakes about their inherent worth?
Yeah, I guess so, right?
Of course.
And isn't
but
that
mine's
like
pretty?
that?
Yeah, but mine's pretty like I can tell. You know what I mean? Like I hear what you're saying, and I have made mistakes about people's inherent worth before. You know?
Yeah.
Like
Well,
I have really wanted to fire a guy who ended up being really good. But I've rarely but I've also kept a lot of people who are complete pieces of shit and should have been let go a long time ago. You know what I mean? I have a really hard time firing anybody is the truth. Me personally, like I don't like firing people.
Sure, it's not, it's anti-human.
I would be a lot more wealthy if I was better at firing people. I'll say that right now, for sure.
Well,
100%.
a part of the sort of union ethos is that we should democratize the workplace, because not only will it be beneficial for the workers, but we're gonna remove from the owner the burden of having to fire somebody. We're gonna make it a democratic process. Like everybody will know when it's time for somebody to be let go because they're not contributing to the productivity of the group, you know? It will be less of a sort of an
I'm
individualized.
interested in
right?
that idea, but like for in my company, right now,
Mhm.
look at the votes, bro. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. It is. I mean, it's interesting to talk about the particular example.
Like
Um,
look at the hands, look at the hands in the room.
You
know? When
often
I'm like,
won't.
hey, I'm gonna fire this guy. Look at the hands in the room. It's gonna be
Well,
petty
so
and
the
Linda stole my
NL,
stapler and that type of shit. You know what I
the
mean?
National Labor Relations Board doesn't have much to say about your company because of its size. Once it reaches a certain size, there will become things that we'll have to start worrying about. But
I am interested. I do like the idea of that. You know what I mean? There is something there, and I do like the idea about that. I like the idea actually of hiring people in a democratic way. Also, like
Mhm.
I like the idea of that. I can't really see a world where that works unless they have equity in the company, though, which will never happen. Right? That's just
Mhm.
not naturally going to, in my opinion, a human instinct to like give away yours.
Well, and also, why would you, I'm so confused.
Why would
Why
you
would
give
you
it?
give away a piece of your company to someone that you just hired that hasn't earned it? I don't get that.
Correct. Earning
Well, the
potential.
idea is that you hire that the folks that are coming on board are going to be equal. You know, it's a joint stock company. You know, like everybody has a share in it. Everybody has a foot.
Well, okay,
Has
so
they're both risking their own livelihoods by
maybe
being a part
maybe
of it.
their profit share is part of the company, but they can't have equity when they first hired. They
Well,
can't
so again,
own
so the
equity.
idea is that there's no ownership, this idea that like you have ownership of the company that you started will have
My
to
whole
simply
body
go
is filled
away.
with like anxiety right now when you're talking.
Well, and that's because at your core, you recognize how reprehensible and bad of an idea that is. And
No,
you
I'm
have like a
interested. I'm
loyalty
interested
to
in it.
like this Marxist concept, but you know in your heart that that's a bad,
No, I
wrong,
don't think so. It's the same thing
unnatural
as like,
idea.
well,
I
hold
do
on
want
though.
to,
I
so,
want to let go of it a little
okay.
bit because like I also have this idea in my mind that this shirt I'm wearing is mine. You know what I mean? Like what is mine, you know? I'm not adverse to the idea that this I think my ideas are mine ultimately, and that's what I have a problem with, right?
So why
Okay.
would you give away equity of your company then when it's built on the backs of your ideas?
Right, exactly. I think that's intrinsically what I have a problem with. Is that the right word? Intrinsically. I think that's what I have a
Maybe.
problem with. Is not the idea that my company is owned by me, because that doesn't even really make sense to me as a company owner,
I think that,
right? But what I can't stand more than anything in the whole world is feeling like I'm dragging people with me. I cannot stand that feeling for one moment. It makes me really
yeah, I think your experience with that colors a little bit of this and it's not wrong to do so, but like,
Well, I think his experience with that is pretty indicative of what most people's experience with a similar situation would be for a reason. Right? Like this is like this is like take this out of the fucking intellectual masturbation test tube and put it in the real world. And I think right there is why some of these noble sounding ideas are so fundamentally flawed. Right? I
okay,
think it's
so, so, I, yeah, you're right. I mean, I think
I think
that,
you would get so much further if you just use different vocabulary.
what?
what do you mean?
Like instead of saying fundamentally flawed, you could say could be challenged by people.
Oh yeah,
You know what I
Howard,
mean? Like
you are rather sort of like abrupt with
you're
like,
you're
Got it.
it is kind of
Sorry.
all or nothing with you, you know?
Sorry.
well, no, what it is it's inflammatory.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
like the flame, dude. And I love you for it. I'll do it with you all day long, but I'm just
Okay, I'll try to be less inflammatory right now. That's
So
fair.
one thing I want to harp on is that Debs is breaking. So our experience with unions are now, even with worker co-ops, to the extent that we're talking about them right now, where there's still like an owner that is just giving away profit share or something like that. That is very much within the paradigm of capitalism, you know, like our experience with unions has very much been sort of shoring off the hard edges of capitalism, where they're sort of poking into workers very hard. Unions have been very good at sort of making that uncomfortability less so, right? But what Debs is really talking about is breaking away fundamentally from the capitalist system. And he says this, and this is before his break, right? This is while he was really working as a union organizer within capitalism. He says, it is useless to say that I had yet to learn the workings of the capitalist system, the resources of its masters and the weakness of its slaves. He's saying, like, I didn't have the brain to be critiquing capitalism yet. Indeed, no shadow of a system even, fell athwart my pathway. He's not thinking about the things that we're talking about right now, for example. He was simply saying, we need to have Saturdays off, how about a 40-hour work week, things like that, right? Which is, it's not sort of like fundamentally altering the worker and the owner's relationship. There's still going to be that division. And so he goes on, he reads Marx in prison and becomes convinced of this idea that actually the domination of the working class will continue and be ever present while there is these two different classes, right? That's like, I want to just make that clear, that like, that's like, I don't have a better word for it. It's fundamental, right? That like, if there is an owner, the workers will be exploited. It doesn't matter how many benefits you can win at the bargaining table. There's still going to be that antagonistic relationship, and until we abolish that, there's not going to be a free society of co-equals. So wanted to say that. And so lastly, because I think that what this answers, this last idea, the communist idea of freedom, this answers the question, what you're talking about, what Debs is talking about, it's all highfalutin and idealistic. What about these like down on the ground realities? And one of the answers to that is to say something like, well, look closely at the idealism. Isn't it worthwhile to continue to sort of reach for it? Because it's, I'm happy to be down here debating the actual realities with you guys, and we can do that in the weeks coming up. But like, the idealism up here is like, let's stay with that for just a minute, and then
That's an interesting take, and I think that out of everything I've heard holds the most weight with me.
Can you
And
say
I'll
it one more time, Brian?
Well, so that there's usually, when somebody's arguing for communism, for example, the response, even in this last hour, is usually like, well, on the ground reality is that my employees, I can't give them equal share of my company because they suck. They're not as smart. They don't know as much as I do. It would bring about the common ruin, right? Not only would I not make my money, they wouldn't. And so if we institute this on a scale the size of the country or the world, this is going to be disaster, right? So like an on the ground sort of like tangible reality of instituting communism is usually defeated by something akin to that argument, right? And so instead of arguing against that, which I'm happy to do and I will, not me, Debs and Marx will, and through my mouth. Why don't we stay with this communist idea, the idealism of communism, for just a minute, just so that we understand what is the goal that they're trying to reach? Because they are still nevertheless committed to it. They hear your response and they say, no, look, ignore that for just a minute. I want to explain why I'm still committed to the idealism of this, right? Like there's something worthwhile here, and we can, you're not really responding to my idealism. You're responding to my idealism with your sort of like.
So let me ask you a question, because again, out of everything that I think you've said, that holds the most weight with me, right?
Mhm.
And again, I'm going to try not to use inflammatory language. What is so we can agree that, yeah, it would be tremendous if everyone had equal resources and equal luxuries, and no one wanted for anything. And so, okay, so if we're gonna leave alone the pragmatism right now and just talk about the idealism, because yeah,
Mhm.
to use your words, it is a worthwhile ideal, this utopian concept, right? At what point do we have to start getting into the weeds surrounding actualizing that? Because yeah, is it helpful and I guess this is a question for you more, Brian, on a philosophical level, is it helpful for us to sit around and discuss, man, utopia would be utopia, right?
Yeah.
That would be fantastic. Or is it more helpful to us
Mhm.
to discuss how do we get to something approximating maybe not utopia but improvement?
This is Plato and Aristotle. This is the fundamental debate in philosophy, really, is like, should we be gosh, what's the word? Inductive or deductive, right?
Hmm.
Should we use the world to inform our conclusions, or should we bring with us our own convictions and the things we know to be true within us, and then study the world with them, right? Um, are you a philosopher, or are you a, somebody who makes the world as you see fit, right?
Sure,
Or are you a
sure.
scientist or whatever? So these are all, I haven't answered your
Yeah,
question, but this is a debate that, I'm not answering it because there is no answer. Like,
got it.
uh, everyone has their own sort of aesthetic preference to that question. Are you somebody who like is, wears your heart on your sleeve and like believes in things and makes the world into that vision?
Yeah,
Or are you somebody that doesn't, and picks up what you find, and changes your, what's inside you? I don't think one's better than the other. It's just, I was born a certain way, I think, right?
yeah. No, for sure. Totally. No, that totally
um
makes sense.
yeah, well, so to answer it, so Eugene Debs' communist vision, the reason why people are so idealistic about this, why it's, people find expression within it, is in this passage. He says, this great body of like us, us workers, will sweep into power and seize the reins of government, take possession of industry in the name of the working class, and it can be easily done. All that will be required will be to transfer the title deeds from the parasites to the producers. And then the working class in control of industry will operate it for the benefit of all. The workday will be reduced in proportion to the progress of innovation or invention, right? Instead of like, the workday will be reduced in proportion to however much money can we make, right? To the proportion to the progress of invention. Every man will work. So what's after that? That passage there, the workday will be reduced in proportion to the progress of invention. What's that? That's after automation, isn't it? How like we're all worried about Chat GPT. We're all worried about automation and AI taking our jobs. Celebrating that shit, shouldn't we?
No.
Well, why? Well,
Don't
okay,
get me
good
started on
question.
Chat
Why
GPT.
not? Why wouldn't we want Chat GPT to do our work for us, and then we get to do what we want to do?
Well, what are we going to do when we've spent our whole lives working?
Well, you can continue to labor, right? But you're not laboring for a wage. Your Chat GPT robot's doing the thing that's like the eking, the part that's like satisfying the bodily
But
functions of like, making a house to live in and food to eat and stuff like that. What I'm
but
saying is remove the thing that's exploiting you. It's not ChatGPT. It's the ones that own ChatGPT, or your owners of your company that are going to employ ChatGPT to oust you. That's the
dude,
real enemy.
they're already doing that.
I know it's a
Like,
problem, and so right, and so yeah, we're worried about it for the same. I share your concerns about it, but I think that like there's a world in which we could utilize that technology for human benefit rather than human misery, right? Isn't that true?
yes, it 1000% is true, but we're not doing that at the
Yeah, and we
moment.
won't. You're right.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yes.
Total agreement. So, and so here's the actual kicker of this quote. He says, every man will work, or at least have a chance to work, and get the full equivalent of what he produces. He will work not as a slave, but as a free man, and he will express himself in his work and work with joy. Then the badge of labor will be the only badge of aristocracy. The industrial dungeon will become a temple of science. The working class will be free and all humanity disenthralled. And so here we have this sort of like collapsing of this sort of introduction to leftism or whatever into Lockeanism. This idea that we can be made free through a communist vision, that communism is a path to freedom. Right. And so we can talk about like the specifics of this. Every man will work and get the full equivalent of what he produces. What does that mean? What does he mean by that? Are workers getting the full equivalent of what they produce now?
I think it depends. Like,
No,
what is the full equivalent? Like, what's the full equivalent for you is not the full equivalent for me. So I think there's like a huge gray area.
Oh, well, there's
Well, are we
that might be
talking-
interesting.
Yeah.
yeah, that's exactly what I was feeling. I feel like Joanna.
Yeah.
but I
What
feel
what
it-
Debs
but
is after and what usually is
the answer
this
is
is
no. I make
interpreted
80%
is no,
of
right.
what the dude paying. You know what I mean? If he's getting a salary of $2,500.
Hold on to what you're saying, Joanna. I just want to explain that like what Debs is after here is this idea that like the only reason you're being employed, the only reason, and that's what I was trying to get out of Howard,
It's to make somebody else money.
is to make the owner money. Like he is
Yeah.
making more, like the relationship that you've engaged in by being a worker, the owner is profiting more. Like
Yeah.
or else he would fire you, right? As we have talked about, right? And so it's always going to be a loss, a loser for the worker. The second it becomes a winner for the loser, the second the worker makes a little bit more than what he's actually,
Isn't that a
deserved.
little bit of a bleak perspective though, that it's a winner and a loser? Isn't it possible that a worker is paid a fair wage in in proportion to the difficulty of the problem that he solves?
It's possible. Well, that's the whole point, right? It's possible. We'd love that. But then it doesn't work out that way. And human greed comes into the equation.
Well, no,
And
but
how
I'm
much
saying,
can I, and
why
the
is it,
envelope gets pushed.
why is it that if the worker makes $100 and the owner of the company makes $120, why is that a loss why isn't that a win for both parties? I'm so confused on that.
I think
What world does that happen?
I
Is my
think
first question. Those
I think
margins are
Howard,
just-
you're actually like asking a really great question. It's getting like to a good point, because that much of a difference, like owner of the company, you're taking on more complex responsibilities, et cetera, and
Sure.
then employees, depending on what your role is within the company, you have a more specialized focus, right? So
Sure.
of course that naturally is not going to be equal. What I think when that becomes a problem is when that wage gap is so extreme.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's an
Yeah.
issue of like the gradient, right? Like the CEO that makes 10 million while the employees that do the bulk of his labor make, I don't know, some tiny amount.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
yeah, I mean, there is something to be said to that like I think what Debs is actually after here is like what I said is like at the moment of agreement of employment, it's a loser for the worker, and the sort of the wherever the lives of that worker is improved through the exchange of being employed, it's not through the sort of like the good luck of being employed by that worker, right? It's just simply the fact that human labor is like an intrinsic part of life, right? Like there should be, well, I don't know about that. Just the simple idea that like that worker is being employed means that worker is making more money for the owner than that worker is taking home in pay. And everything that
Yeah,
you
which
guys say
which I
is
agree with,
right.
which I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely, of course. But I just don't see that as like
That's like an inherent problem.
yes,
for sure.
yes.
But again, but the vision here, the vision, the idealistic vision is that you as a worker can make 100% of your value, right? It doesn't
Got
have
it.
to be 80%, 70%, 40%. It doesn't have to be.
Got it.
We can have a society in which you make 100%. Let's start there and we'll work downwards. The next idea, he will work not as a slave but as a free man. And so this brings to mind the other question: why can't you? You're not a slave. Why don't you just quit? Your job is that bad. Why don't you quit and get a new one? Or why don't you start
Yes.
your own company, etc. Debs rejects that idea. He says, no, we are slaves no matter whether or not we're employed or unemployed or even have a good job. If we're not working as free men. What does he mean by that? What would be working as free men?
Having equal
Yeah.
opportunity at grand enterprise, for
Yeah.
an example. Yeah.
Having equity in the company you work for.
Yeah.
And then also on that same token, choice, right? Like I want to do this job, I want to do this job, and not being like,
Totally.
forced into a
Totally.
particular brand of labor based on your
That's right.
social circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah, like you might desire to but just your soul might find its expression in painting, right? In something that doesn't make any money.
Well,
really,
hold
in
on.
like
Can
a
we stop
modern.
talking about money so much and perhaps,
Okay.
and maybe we have to, but could we explore talking about it in terms of utility instead, or value added to others? I would,
Yeah,
because I
but we
would
can't
argue,
quantify that
well,
without,
no, totally. But I would argue that,
But
no,
I
for
agree
sure.
that we should consider like
Isn't that a factor in
non-monetary
this?
ways to quantify utility, because a painter, for example, the only way you can make money as a painter is by being extremely famous.
Well,
Like,
but hold on. I think you're, yes, that's true. But I think you're taking it the
but there's
direction I was
far many
going.
more painters. See, there are people who
Yeah,
would rather paint, right?
yes, that's the direction I was going with it, is why would we,
Incentivize those folks to do that rather than taking out the trash or something.
yeah, I mean, that's very reductive response, but yes, right? Why are
That's
there
a good
not?
counter. It's a good one. Like we need ditch diggers, right?
Yes.
Totally.
And well,
And
here's what I'm pausing. I'm trying to come up like, okay, like I'm trying to give credence to some of your ideas that perhaps are tough for me to wrap my head around. And let's say that there for a second, let's say those are, yeah, we need to come up with this way to, everyone needs to live in the same house and have the same X, Y, and Z, or at least, to Joanna's point, which I actually, that is a point that I think holds some water. At least that gap, that delta needs to be no more than 20 or 30%. It certainly shouldn't be 1,000 or 10,000%.
Plato said that.
So okay. And again, I'm not convinced fully of that. Okay. So then why, okay, to make that society that you guys are advocating for work, I don't, where is the room for people to be just 24/7 painters, as
Yeah.
opposed to being contributors to the things that actually add the real value, i.e. the shelter and the food and the production and the delivery of the children's services and the medical care and da da da. And I think this goes back to your point, Brian, about like, the automated, gay communist state where the robots just fan us while we like eat grapes and sit around naked in the sunlight and draw and create poetry. But I think
Wait, I like this. What?
Brian, yeah, this is Brian's utopia.
Yeah,
Fully
wait, keep
automated
going,
luxury
keep
gay
going.
space communism.
Yeah, that's what you call it, luxury gay space communism. Yeah.
Can there be
But
unicorns too, please?
Sure.
Sweet.
but
Sit
if
around
we're
and draw.
if we're but you know what I'm getting at? Like, again, I'm not even trying
Totally.
to, I'm trying to really
and,
take,
and there isn't, so the frustration with Marxism is that he famously didn't want to answer these questions. And so there's just been like 200 years of people trying to answer these questions. And so I could give you all the ones that I know, but they're rather boring. But we will like work with that problem again for the next few weeks. It's a good critique, and it's not one that has the best answer whatsoever. I think the most reasonable one is that we would all take turns cleaning the toilets,
Got it.
right?
Okay.
Like there would be a sort of like mutual understanding.
Everyone's got to clean the
In-
I
toilets.
actually
your
grew up
Duna-
in a place where everyone had their own jobs and whatever, but everyone also had their property. And there's these acequias and water rights on the property, and the only you could pay people to do your part of the work, but every property owner had to commit like 30 hours a
Mhm.
year of digging ditches specifically in this community in town.
Yeah, like there's been
It'd be
like
something
actual
like that. So like I'd
hard
be showing
social
up to my
scientists like do work into like you know, the primitive communities and stuff, and you know, indigenous communities that like do sort of organically, naturally come to these sorts of like arrangements. You know, they're
That's
not
cool.
contracts, but they sort of are.
Dude, and so
we
I
all, we
love
all know, like we all like kind of intuitively know that like we're fucked unless somebody does this, and so like eventually there's some arrangement that gets worked out. You
It's
know?
like summer camp. Like that's exactly how being a camp counselor works. Like your daily chores or your weekly chores or, you know, afternoon duties or breakfast duty, like it all rotates and you all have that understanding. Yeah.
dude, and I love that because what you at least maybe unintentionally, but what you just described was like something that was birthed in nature, right? As opposed to something that is in conflict with nature, which I guess with
Constructed.
yeah, no, not constructed, but in direct conflict. And again, I'm trying not to use incendiary language, but to me, sometimes some of these ideas seem to be rather than
Against
in
human
harmony
nature.
with, yeah, rather than be in
If only
harmony
Marx
with nature.
considered human nature, right?
Well, no, I'm not even
It's,
saying
it's a
that.
joke.
That's
it's a joke.
that.
Because
But
he
I know.
does, and we will talk about it. But
But again, I'm trying not to use inflammatory language, but I think that it's tough for me sometimes because in that example you just used, yeah, like that's this very harmonious natural order that's kind of arisen, and that I would even argue works in that on that scale, right? I'd say it probably works the best out of any of these systems on that scale. But when we start to talk about these millions of interconnected globalized communities,
Yeah.
it becomes tough for me to reconcile something that again does feel to use mild language, a little bit unnatural.
so you guys, I think you left a couple weeks ago when we talked about Jefferson's ward system. It'll come up again. This idea that like maybe our best political communities are much smaller than we've been grown to accustomed to. But so we already sort of talked about this idea of expressing yourself in your work. But this is a really sort of expansive idea that's actually going to carry us we're going to read something in a second here that's going to tell us more about this. But Marx is going to be fascinated with this idea that like you are somehow the things that you do are you, or like make you who you are, right? The stuff that you work with your hands is yours, and it's not, there's some abomination that happens when our work becomes not of our own. And so Debs picks up on this, that like we will express ourselves in our work, that like our work is actually a part of us, and this is an important part of being a human being. And so again, we'll talk about this more over the next few works, but that we will work with joy. And Marx doesn't really use joy as a sort of concept to talk about work. He's much more fascinated with this idea that like working is just something we do, and it's who we are, and it's like what makes us human. But Debs is bringing up this. It's worthwhile to mention. But so I want to finish today by just introducing Hegel, which is really silly because like Hegel's like famously the most incomprehensible guy. To be honest, I've
That
never
dude's
read
face is incomprehensible.
like longer than a paragraph of Hegel without like wanting to kill myself. But there is one paragraph that I really like that I've brought out for us because it actually tells us a lot about where we're going to go in the next few weeks. Famously, Marx was fascinated with Hegel. Hegel was Marx's dude. They differed in many ways. Hegel was like a generation.
Hegel was his landlord.
No, that's Engels.
Sorry.
It's yeah, but right. It's the same kind of, it's a similar type of relationship in some respects, but Hegel is Marx's intellectual grandfather, and Engels is Marx's like benefactor, right? Patron or whatever, right? Landlord is a good term as well. Lifelong friend. But anyway, we'll talk about Marx in specific later. But Hegel predates Marx, and so we machine, right? We're leaving Debs. We're going way back in time to Hegel, and Hegel gives us something that Marx will be fascinated by and turn on its head and turn inside out and carry the rest of his life's work from this starting point. And so this is I think what Marx is sort of fascinated most by is this idea in Hegel, which I'll just read the whole thing. So he says, this is Hegel. He says, the scene has often been pictured in which a blind person suddenly gains sight, sees the dawn, the growing light, and then the sun as it blazes up. At first, in his complete amazement, he forgets himself utterly in this pure clarity. But when the sun has fully risen, his amazement is lessened. He looks at the objects around him, and from them he goes on to see his own inwardness, and then the relation of outer to inner. He proceeds from inactive contemplation to activity. By evening, he has constructed some sort of building by the use of his own inner sun. And when he contemplates it in the evening, he values it higher than the first external sun, for he now stands in relation to his own creative spirit, and hence in relation of freedom, because that spirit is related to itself. If we keep this image before us, we can see the course of world history in it, the great daily work of the spirit. And so you can kind of sense why everyone's so frustrated with Hegel, because he's just writing. This is in German that's been translated. It's awful. It's just terrible writing. But in it are really important ideas here. And so the first really important idea is the awareness of outer. So we as human beings are separate from the world, right? This comes from Hegel. Is not disagreeing with this, and well, perhaps slightly he does, but it's very much in us that we have this sort of like distinct relationship between us and the world. We are somehow distinct, right? Others have critiqued this, and we can talk about that as well. But awareness of outer, it's out there, it's not us. But since it's out there and it's not us, we must have something. Awareness of inner, I am something. I, the capital I, right? As opposed to as opposed to you or the world. Awareness of inner, awareness of outer. The next thing we have is the imagining of a house. Right? So we can take something that is in our own head. We imagine something. Because we have seen out into the world, we have sort of collected nature's bounty within our thoughts, and we sit down and we imagine a house. We construct in our minds the image of something that we want to produce. The next thing we do is we actually produce it, right? We transform nature's materials into that house. So that thing that was once in our head, actually before that, it was out there in the world. We got the idea out there. It came into our head. We constructed it in our head. And now we're going to construct it out in the real world. And we're going to use nature's materials to do it, right? And then once we have actually constructed this house, we are going to stand back in astonishment that we have constructed something greater than nature. We have taken nature's materials, nature's ideas, mixed with it our own ideas, our own inner sun, and then used our hands ourselves to create this thing out into the world. We have labored. And through this laboring, we realize our freedom, because we have made nature's materials into something that serves us through our own manifestation, right? And so again, this is really sort of esoteric. This is really like out there, right? But this is Hegel. But this is Marx picks up on this, and what he gets from it is this idea that laboring is the human activity. We're not the political animal that Aristotle says we are. We're not the sort of contentious, fighting, self-interested animal of Hobbes. We're not the philosophical animal maybe of Plato. We're not the property owning animal of Locke. We are the laboring animal, because guess what? We can take something out in the world and actually realize it using our own head. We are not beholden to the biology. Like a beaver can only make a dam, can they? A bee can only make a hive. A spider can only make a web. We can make a dam, a hive, and a web, and a house, and a building, and a street, and a company. We can labor creatively. And through that activity, we can actualize ourselves. We realize our own individuality. We realize our uniqueness, and we realize our freedom. And so this is what Marx will pick up from Hegel. He will pick up this idea that freedom comes from the human activity of labor. And that when that labor is bastardized somehow, divorced from you, alienated from you, the products of your labor are alienated from you, laboring with others is alienated from you, the relationship between you and your fellow workers or the owner or the boss, when all these things become alien to you, alien to your nature, which is to labor, that is a world historic tragedy. And so in this idea, we get this idea that freedom in Marx is creative self-actualization. And it's a materialist form of creative self-actualization. And when this is where he disagrees with Hegel, because Hegel's very idealist, right? The outer sun, the inner, the sun in your head, the sun out there. The ideas really drive history for Hegel. Marx says material drives history. The world drives history, how we interact with the world, how we're actually digging things up. And so he would agree with you, Howard. Let's get out of this idealist world. Ideal of communism. No, I'm a scientist. I want to tell you exactly the ins and outs, the X's and Y's, why this is a better system. And so the idea that we should sort of carry us into next week, and we'll say goodbye, is this idea of materialism. And the quote that's very famous from Marx, every Marx quote is very famous, but the most famous quote by Marx on this idea of materialism goes as follows. And there's a very funny meme that we all are fans of, a meme that I think is best expressed with this quote. And this is what Marx says. He says, the mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. And so here he's disagreeing very much with, I think, the long line of philosophers that we've read up until this point. Maybe Locke agrees with him in a materialist sense. But Marx here is saying we live in a society, and that's what gives us our ideas. It's not the fact that we are born understanding certain things, or it's not the fact that capitalism is natural. It seems natural to us because that's the world we live in. That's the idea here. And so it's with this idea that he wants us to have an open mind, I'd say, moving forward to the next few weeks, because he's saying, ask yourself if your first objection to what I have to say is because of some intrinsic truth, or is it because of the world you live in? Because if your social existence is determined by the material realities of your life, we actually might be able to change the material realities of your life, and it might change your ideas. That's his contention to us. That's what he would ask of us, is to have that sort of ability to abstract. So anyway, that is for next week. Thanks, guys. Did you guys want to? Well, it's pretty late. Why don't we wrap it up, guys, right? Sound good?
Yeah, that was good. That was great. Really,
Thanks, everybody.
There's a lot of overlap with Star Trek. So much.
Really?
Yes.
mean,
Insane amount. Yeah.
He literally looks like Jean-Luc, but with
With hair and a
hair.
really long
This is what
beard.
happens when you put a hair in a beard.